All except Toby. They have a special dispensation because he's the oldest person here.
The oldest Pope here.
The oldest
The only Pope.
the only Protestant Pope. Agnostic Pope or atheist Pope or heathen Pope.
Yeah,
All that.
Welcome to...
Jewish too.
Frank's got a story about Jewish racing drivers at Nürburgring. Welcome to the latest in this series of events that have been put on by the HSRCA to celebrate the history of people involved in the sport, in particular drivers. The HSRCA is all about historic racing cars, but there's no racing cars without drivers, and we all enjoy recreating the scenes that took place many years ago. But it was the people like those who we've honoured so far, people like Jack Brabham and Kevin Bartlett and Spencer Martin and tonight Frank Gardner, who were the stars of the cars that we enjoy playing with now. I say playing with because what we do is nothing like what they do to them. I'm sure you'll agree. The isolation of Australia, the splendid isolation of Australia, has been challenged in the last few weeks with some nasty goings on to our north, but for most of the time Australia has enjoyed splendid isolation. We like it down here in our little part of the bottom of the world, away from most of the trouble spots of the world. But it has a disadvantage too, and that is that if you want to make a name for yourself, and it's usually in various areas of sport, then you have to leave our shores to do it. We've seen that done successfully with other racing car drivers, and Jack Brabham and Alan Jones obviously come to mind. But if you're ever going to make a name for yourself in motorsport, you've got to leave Australia. Now, the problem with that is that when people succeed, as Frank certainly has, we don't get to hear much about it, at least not firsthand. We can't duck down to Warwick Farm or to whatever the Sandown Park or whatever the circuits were at the time to enjoy watching them doing the things that they do best. We read about it in books and magazines, and it all seems a little bit far away. So it's a great opportunity tonight to talk to Frank and to listen to what he has to say and to learn a bit more about what he's done. We think we know, but I'm sure that by the end of the night you'll realise that we know too little about the exploits of this great driver. When people go overseas to try their fortune, and as I said, many have tried, some have succeeded. The ones who haven't, we probably haven't heard about. But if you were to go overseas and get jobs with the likes of Aston Martin and Alan Mann and so on, and you did okay, then you might say, well, my aim is to win the Christ, Peter. Where have you gone? It'd be nice to say that, I mean, perhaps the ultimate prize, if you're working in England, would be to become the champion racing driver of the United Kingdom. Frank did it twice. It'd be good to know that your exploits were rewarded with, say, a British Saloon Car Championship. We've seen those happen here, and the champions who have succeeded in our touring car championships are lauded as gods. Frank won five British Saloon Car Championships. He also won the European Formula 2 a European Formula 2 Championship, a European Saloon Car Championship, and perhaps relatively recently, and perhaps most importantly, European Formula 5000 Championship, when 5000s were running with Formula 1 cars. He came back to Australia and instead of hanging up his helmet, took on the fearsome Chev Corvair, which, I just want to let you know, Frank, that I think about you and I care about you. Cam's put out the Cam's report a few months ago, a year or so ago, when you joined the elite group of Cam's membership of honour recipients. There are only 8 of you, and you're in very good company, as you obviously you know. Jack Brabham, Phil Irving, Gary Cooper, Alan Jones, Gary Connolly, yourself, Frank, Harry Firth and Bob Jane. The good old Cams, they made a few mistakes in your entry, so I sent them a little note and said, you know, some of the facts you got a bit wrong there about Frank. So I got a very nice note back from the editor of the CAMS report thanking me for my interest and pointing out a few things. So they printed it in the CAMS manual, it's exactly the same. They reckon you started at XK 150. They said 120. They said you won 100 international race wins, and in fact you won. In fact, Frank was the first man ever to win 100 international saloon car championships. They said you won the sports sedan championship in 1976. It was 1977, and I got that out of the same book that the mistake was in. And the car was a Chev Corsair, which is a car that I don't think General Motors recall building. Ford built a Corsair, General Motors built a Corsair. So tonight I want to ask Frank to come up and have a talk with us about various aspects of his amazing career, which continues today up on the Gold Coast at his driver training school. And in particular, I'd like to ask him, because I want to get in before you do, about some of the people he worked with and some of the cars he drove. And when we've been through that, we'll open the floor to questions. So to pinch a couple of your lines, Frank, in spite of the fact that you are busier than a one-armed paper hanger in a thunderstorm, or a one-legged man at a bum-kicking contest, you've found the time to come down from Queensland, to come and honour us tonight and to be here on the weekend. Please come up and have a chat with us, Frank Gardner.
You've only got 1 hour.
Stephen, just because you're the bloody Pope, it doesn't mean you're being de-sanctified.
I thought you were going to say something else there.
Think about that. It's pretty difficult, isn't it? Because you came into the business, you were here in the early days when we had glass in our goggles, and we had metal frames, and if the glass didn't get in your eye, the metal frame went through your brain. We sat in cars with fuel tanks, which you people bravely restore these days. The fuel tank is either side of you. The pickup tank is above the family jewels. And the final delivery tank is under your bum. So if you do hit a fence at high speed, you do attend your own barbecue. And then in those days, at least you hit, it's a metal to metal. We used to run into straw bales, and there's nothing like having the fire burn for a couple of days. Everybody would have thought about it. And then there was Mr. Les Leston, coming to light originally with the flame-proof overalls. They were great. We eventually put one down alongside a normal piece of rag out of a rag bag, and the flame-proof overall disappeared very quickly, while the other rag just smouldered. Les had done a brilliant marketing job. They were blue, they had Dunlop on them, and nobody really gave a bug whether they caught a light or not. Because if they did catch a light, the chances were, if you're in Italy, if you weren't dead when you arrived at the hospital, you certainly would be when they started. And you go on with helmets. I mean, they were a brilliant design. You had leather come down over the side with little holes left out so you could hear your engine. You talk to Jack Brabham these days, you say, "Jack, who's in pole position at Monaco?" He says, "It's 2:30. So his hearing's not impaired at all. If he's in the fight business, he'd make Cassius Clay look quite stable. So I see Jack tacks up for morning tea at least twice a week. The moment he's gone over to Goodwood, but he will be back, and I will have a cream bun for him because Jack likes a cream bun with his coffee. And Jack enjoys a conversation, and I talk till my tonsils pack up. And as soon as we get enough money, I've invested in a loud halo. But you've, and the whole thing, the race meetings, the venues, the professionalism that's come along, and Bernie Eccleston. I'm very fortunate these days. I sit with Professor Sid Watkins. Professor Sid Watkins, people will say, who is this man? He's one of 2 neurosurgeons in the world that have the qualifications. His counterpart is in America. Sid is a dyed-in-the-wool Englishman. Lovely man, and we were actually first on the scene when Hakkinen decided to put it in an Adelaide raceway at high speed into McLaren. When we got there, he was severely dead. The air supply had shut down and a whole heap of things had shut down. Sid slit his throat, dropped the tube down, restored the air supply, kick-started the heart, and the boy's back jogging for his 2nd year in a World Championship. In our days, the best you could have hoped for was a plastic sheet on a rainy day, but nothing else. It has improved so much with these people, but being with Professor Watkins, I can walk around, see the Michael Schumachers, see the current state of the art, see where the engines are, still talk to the Jackie Stewarts, and it is a far cry from the days where we used to come out to the Tasman series, and you would go to places like Wigram Airfield in New Zealand. I can remember Piers Courage asking me what happened to Lord Wigram. Oh boy. But it was a different state. They would have an airfield. Come morning, they would have the latrines in. They would have absolutely the stands, all scaffolding. Straw bales once again around the hangars, and if you missed the straw bales, you could dive into the hangar where all the petrol cans were anyway. They supplied the beautiful porcelain trays. So if you dumped an engine, you could pour the oil and keep all the fauna and everything beautiful, the lawns. So these big porcelain trays went under the aircraft. If they dripped oil and they were parked on the grass, nothing was impaired. It was a great situation. I can remember we blew a Climax, which wasn't too unusual with a 2.5 litre Climax, and Alec Mildren. And we had a little mechanic working for us called Mumbles, who never said anything, and at the end of it all there was a lot of petrol and oil and residue in the porcelain tray. We took it to the toilet, tipped it down the toilet, he mumbled something else. It was a hot day, threw a match down on top of it, and there was a reasonable woof. It was, but you know, nothing too spectacular. The only end product, to let you know, was about an 18-stone Maori came out of the end cubicle. And that wasn't too serious, but he still had his trousers down around his ankles, thinking that it was something he ate. And they're blocking the whole corridor. And if he'd have worked out what would have happened, because here we are standing there with a petrol-contained tray, and you wouldn't have to be a brain surgeon like Sid Watkins to work out that we were the cause of the explosion. So little Mumbles walked up to him. It was only up to his navel anyway, looked up in his eyes and said, "You haven't wiped your ass." Now, drifted back into the toilet. Thank goodness. We had a care passage and so on, and you can talk about one funny thing a year, and you know, if you're going for the years you've been in it, but I always remember Lady Wigram Trophy around those incidents with Piers Courage wondering what happened to Lord Wigram and Mumbles and a petrol train. Yeah.
We only have one microphone, this is a cheap night, so I'm going to have to keep interrupting Frank, but I want to ask him to talk about some various periods through his life, and I suppose no better place to start than the early days. Tell us a bit about your uncle Hope Bartlett and the start in motorsport, the TA, the C-type, the D-type, of course the Excalibur 20. Perhaps Dr. Borman, he was a strange character, Jack Davies, some of those early characters, Frank.
I suppose over the state of the art at that time, by today's standards of the professional world, it is very hard to see where these people sit, but like the Jimmy Clarks comparing him with Senna, it's very hard to make a comparison. And with Fangio, but Hope Bartlett decided at an early stage that motorcycles were dangerous things, and I was going to hurt myself on them. I should stop, buggerising around with them, I think was a Shakespearean phrase, and turned my attention to cars, which we did in between. I was very much mixed up in surf clubs and trying to build, at that point in time, the Whale Beach Surf Club, and had a garage at Whale Beach, and so we slowly but surely, in between the spare time that it was available, turned over from MGs first, and there were some pretty imposing people in MGs, and I can remember Cole James, which I brought up tonight with Barry Gardner and Ian Spees. I'm sitting at the table with, and Barry's a former hill climb man, and Ian has followed motorsport and dabbled in it in the early days. But there were people like Cole James in MGs, and to a young person looking at them, I mean, Cole James with the Jack Brabbens and the people around, they were world class really, because Jack went across and proved his point, whereas Cole never left the shores, but he was Jack's equal at that point in time. So where the man could have gone, and it was quite imposing. And I can remember with the XK, and I had a fair amount of tuition off Hope, and I was later to learn an awful lot and find out some of it was right and some of it was wrong. It's only the theatre of life teaches you these things. But I can remember Tony Ardito walking up to me at the first meeting at Mount Druitt, and Cole James was there with his Mark V and whatever have you, all gutted out, and he said that just keep an eye, because you know, when he comes up to lap you, Clive will be, so I couldn't really think, being a competitor in the surf and a swimmer and things like that. I thought, well, that doesn't sound quite right. Anyway, the end product was I buggered off and won the race the first time out, and then I was, you know, cheeky enough and I suppose nasty enough to walk over and ask Tony what happened to Clive. But I was later to gain quite a lot of respect for both Tony and Clive, because they put together very good exercises, and Stan Smith, I can recall him working in that particular arena as a great alloy man and panel beater, and we had some great skills in the country and some great people, but your original first impressions stick in your mind, and it'd be nice when you're a young bloke, when you're growing up, if they'd put a zipper on your mouth and only open it up at the correct times, because you do fall down an awful lot of holes that in actual fact had Clive had the machinery and the ability to blow the backside off me, but it didn't work out that way on that day. But Dr. Balmer then, you mentioned him, interesting man, bought a Jaguar C-Type, but the history of the C-Type says that everybody from Dr. Balmer had a big accident in it. It was no stranger to having a hit. I think I've heard it many times, but Elvis had a few, but this C-Type wasn't far behind him. And I eventually bought the thing off an insurance company when he did a custom line on Cessnock Bridge, and the occupants in the custom line had died, and Dr. Balmer wasn't far behind it because it was a fair old ravine where the thing had gone into. And I bought the wreckage off the insurance company and proceeded to try and get it straightened out with people like Alan Stanfield and all kinds of things. You can visualise the technical knowledge that a mousetrap manufacturer would have about a C-type Jag. I think it was things like that increased the ageing process with Lofty England. But nevertheless, we managed to get it all together. And in getting it all together, it was quite successful. When it came together, we couldn't get the thing to run cool because the original radiator had so many tubes buggered up in it and they couldn't get it straight, so we eventually found a radiator out of the Fargo utility, altered the grill accordingly and put it in. The purists these days would hemorrhage, but it was functional and it went and it won whatever races it started in. I think it had one retirement, which unfortunately was at Bathurst, but it was doing all right. But in the early morning, I think it had won the Brigade scratch race from the likes of Alec Mildrum and Len Lukey and whatever have you, and in the 100-miler a lead had come off a fuel pump. But that would be in spite of us, not because of us. because you look back on these things and the system in preparing the cars, and you work a few years with Eric Broadley's and people of that fame, you learn a little bit about preparation. There's the Patrick Heads and the John Bernards and the Tony Southcotes that have all come through that era, have learnt that there's a right way to do it, and we're not interested in any other way.
Okay. Then you went to Europe and first started with Aston Martin, and is that where you met John Wyer? What about some of the times with John Wyer? Because that really came before your Lola times, didn't it?
Oh yeah, very much so. The John Wyer side of it was, I'm trying to help Stephen out because he's done more homework and he seems to know more about me than my first wife Gloria. It's, well, I took off in those days, I suppose, like a lot of people, like Cat Wiggington and his dick. And I said that wrong also, you know, it's always, you come here and have a few drinks before you speak, you're bound to get it wrong. No, I actually went across on the free medical and stayed for 20 odd years. That was the only way to get your teeth fixed in those days. We haven't invented that then. But yes, I was going to work at Coventry at the Jaguar place, but I found arriving there in winter and the fog, and it was quite depressing from the life I'd led, and I thought it just has to be a little better. I'll just have a look around London, and it so happened that Ted Cutting, who was the chief designer at Aston Martin, was looking for a little bit of a pencil labourer, and John Wyer, who was commonly known as Death Ray in those days, was in charge of Aston Martins. And I can remember him talking to me at Le Mans one time, and he singled me out, I suppose, because I was a little bit unique in the area to the normal run of the lads, and they'd worked about 3 all-nighters on the trot, and there wasn't a great deal of them left in spirit or physical bearing. And he said to me, "Gardner," he said, "are you listening?" I said, "Sir." He said, my crew doesn't worry me so much, and they don't scare the enemy, but by God, they frighten the organisation." Poor buggers were all out on their feet, and it was in the days of segregation, because the drivers and the managers and whatever have you, the David Yorks, the John Wyers and all that, they stayed at one hotel. The mechanics were virtually in the stable. That was a fixed menu with a jug of vin ordinaire if they were good lads, and you could then go back to work after the evening meal, and that was it. And they never, you know, you weren't allowed to dine with the gentry. That was it. The George Abacassis and all those people, they and Death Ray ruled the place. But then, having said that, I can remember being absolutely shocked because it was a learning experience. I can remember being at Le Mans and a car went by and John Wyer said, Totter, did you get a time on that vehicle, number 29? I said, "No, John, I'm terribly sorry, I missed that one. Stupid fucking cow." And it would straighten you up, you know. Yeah. But there we are, you know, there's the highlights of all these things that do stick in your mind from time to time. Stephen, you've done the research, carry on. You flatter me to think I
Would you like me to take over? I think What about the early days with Jack and the MRD?
Well, that was really, MRD was Motor Racing Developments, and his advisor when Jack wanted to leave Coopers was a man called Javi Cromback. Javi was responsible for a couple of things, and the last dealing I ever had with Javi was he organised a race in Russia. And I will get back, in case you think I've got dementia or something, I'll get back. Javi organised a race in Russia, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the MRD, of course, and this is all a learning curve from the Ron Tornax onwards. He just said you can't have a vehicle called MRD because MRD in French is shit. And you can't have a shit race car. It's not going to work. The French are going to laugh at you. So the car then became a Brabham. And of late, when Ron rebought the thing, it became a Rolt again. It was reborn. But Jack and Jack was always and was boundless energy. The reason Jack became 3 times world champion, it had probably cost him 4 times world champion, that tenacity, because the time he crashed at Monaco, he'd been up all night, and that particular accident, 1 corner from the finish, cost him his 4th world championship. He had it all wrapped up. He was to be 4 times world champion, 1 corner from home, and he'd been up till about 2 in the morning that morning, and then sat in and drove Monaco. Pistons, I think, were hitting the top of the head, and Jack had to machine a little bit off the top of the pistons to get it all to work. But the tenacity of the man, you would work all nighters. There was a Tim Walls, a Roy Billingtons. These were the mechanics of that era. They were brilliant boys, but never quite had the stamina. I mean, Jack's alive, Roy's dead, Tim's dead. I must have nipped out of the workshop just in time. But although Ron Tornackers has managed to hang on and just published his book, but it was Jack's tenacity and his ability, and he's a very good engineer. All that, the tolerances near enough wasn't good enough, and he was a great improviser. But mind you, he flew an aeroplane like he drove a car, and sometimes the downwind checks weren't that reliable. And I can remember falling asleep once, and he thought I was in control, and I thought he was in control. So when you add some of these things up, you're bloody lucky to be standing here talking about it. And then sheepishly calling in to find out exactly where we are, depending who was going to answer us, the French, the Italians, or what. And, so all these things have, you know, like Jack, you can't speak highly enough of Jack with the effort he put into it, because it was, have you brought along a friend tonight, Archie, to drink your wine? Yeah. It's nice to think they've got it tasting good red, isn't it? Yes. I have heard it said pissed as a cricket. Nice little authentic display. You know, in between everybody there is a team, and Jack was a great judge of people, and it's certainly a good house guest, that one. So, you know, on each individual you can speak and the accolades, and you won't please all the people all the time. I mean, Ron Tornak was probably one of the most difficult individuals I ever worked for, but fortunately I was in a position where I didn't have to work for him, and I was able to, and when a deal came up, I think instead of driving for Ron, although I did do a season for Ron and Jack in Formula 2, but I went off with a lad, Paul Hawkins, and we drove for an Ian Walker in a semi-back team, and it just meant, instead of being out of the Braddon Works team and being with Ian Walker, it just meant that some nights you got to bed, but while you were assured you weren't going to get to bed. Yeah.
Frank, in all the titles you've won, the ones I mentioned earlier, one that is unofficial but I think probably as important as any, and I've heard it said a number of times, that you are considered to have been the world's best development driver, and certainly the contracts you had with people like Ford and Lola and Goodyear would suggest that that's true. You speak very highly of the person who I think was who said that, Eric Broadley. You have a lot of time for him, and Alan Mann was another team manager that you have a lot of time for.
Yeah, this year I went across to Tuscaloosa, to Alabama, where Mercedes have a four-wheel drive factory, and they produce about 100,000 units a year there at the factory. But the reason I was in that part of the world, I was down in Florida with Alan Mann, who has a little estate down there, and it was a bugger of a place to stay at, because on this estate it only had 3 golf courses, and its own airport for jet aircraft. So it was a bloody hardship to be there, and it's terrible to think these lads are falling on such hard ground. But he didn't seem to want a donation, he seemed to be all right with that. But they're interesting because they find out Sir John Whitmore was across there. He was to join Alan in a few weeks. They were going off diving in the Bahamas. But marvellous people in the sense that Alan Mann was like a Frank Williams ahead of his time. They were there, and when Fords first went to Le Mans and they came there with the GT40s, Holman and Moody ran one team, Carcraft ran another, and Alan Mann ran the other. And although I was driving for Alan Mann, at that particular time I was seconded to drive for Holman and Moody. And Sir John Whitmore and myself drove the car, and Fords had a big picture of it when I went across to the Festival of Speed at Goodwood, and it was still the quickest car down the straight at Le Mans because we rang up Orly Airport and got some actuals on the weather, knew the temperatures, jetted the bloody great V8 right, and we were timed between the hours of 2:15 and 4:30, regular at 259.4 miles an hour. So if you want to convert that to kilometres, you didn't shift your chewing gum too far, I can assure you. Because it was light rain and a little bit of fog about. So we didn't have the downforce of the wing. And I noticed this year that Gerhard Berger had said to Norbert Haag, who's competition manager of Mercedes, and Gerhard is with BMW, and they had the manufacturers meeting down at Monaco, and he said to Norbert, "You will be flying down in one of your Le Mans cars." What's the reason? They did go down like a ton of bricks because there's very little humour in that part of the world, I can assure you. I've been there, done that, and driven for Porsches and things like that, and I did suggest at one stage that they designed a circuit for Jewish racing drivers, and they weren't impressed. And I did think that Adolf Hitler penciled it out. So,
What about the 917 of the gas-filled tubes?
well, the 917 of the gas-filled tubes was the early stages, and they were. It was a pretty dangerous motor car because it was only on 10-inch wheels. You had about 350 horsepower at about 5,000 revs. And then in the next 1500 you picked up another 350 horsepower. And on 10-inch wheels in the rain at the Nürburgring. Because when Huschke von Hamstein rang me up and said, "Would I like to drive the car?" I said, "Huschke, I don't really think I want to drive it, but you must come out and drive the car." I said, "Well, why don't you get Brian Redmond to drive it?" "Brian Redmond is in hospital in Bonn." I said, "Well, what about Joe Sifford?" "Joe Sifford is in hospital in Cologne." I said, "Well, Vic Elford's doing nothing." "Vic is already in Cologne hospital with some others." "For Christ's sake, Huschke, you got anybody left?" Anyway, David Piper and I went out and drove it. And David lasted a lap and climbed out. He said he was too young to die. So I persevered on, and I think we finished 5th. I'm not sure, the records I think show 5th. We brought it home, and that night they gave me a leather suitcase full of marks and the Iron Cross. Oh, he did say, well, if the pressure dropped on the gauge, you drives the car, if the pressure drops on the gauge, you drives the vehicle, you drives the red wagon, very carefully back to the pit. I said, if the pressure drops 1 bar in that gauge, I'm parking the bastard and giving a lift back. Because I think they had helium in the frame anyway. So, you know, I just didn't want to be there for the bang. And that particular car we drove, John Wolfe bought it and ran at Le Mans and came between Chris Amon and myself on the first lap because Amon and myself had got away first. And the thing hit the wall, because he never looked like going around White House, hit the wall, exploded, and unfortunately that was the end of John Wolfe. And Eamon's Ferrari caught a light one side of the road, and my GT40 was a light the other side of the road. But then my fire went out. I had full tanks of fuel because it was the first lap, but it went out miraculously, so I drove it back to the pit, and the gauges weren't moving, and I thought, well, maybe it's gone through a capillary tube or something, but it had burned through the radiator hoses. The heat was that intense, and there was no water in the system, so my Le Mans finished there and then, and that was my 14th Le Mans, so I decided there wasn't enough money in the bank. I'd had my warning, and it was an unbiased, unprejudiced race run by the French and a bunch of other mugs.
You've driven with and had a lot to do with some very well-known drivers over the years. What about Sir John Whitmore? He had a bit of a reputation for not turning up for qualifying, is that right?
Well, he had so many commitments in those days. John had to arrive at fairs and kiss babies and do all kinds of things. And when we were doing the American series, I used to have to put on Sir John's outfit and his overalls, and he had a helmet, and I think he had H2SO4 written on the helmet, which was sulfuric acid, as I remember right. It was just one of those things that, you know, the bloke, there's eccentricity sort of ran along the bloodline of that particular thing, because I can remember Sir John sitting alongside me when we were on our way in South Africa to attend a presentation we'd featured at Kyalami, and we were going to Francis Tucker's house, and Bobby Altoff, it's a long story, but Bobby had shunted the car through the night, and we'd finished, and he rang from the hospital to say that he'd see us down there, and he was very pleased, and he was a good South African. Christ, he was very happy that we'd won the race, and he was all right in hospital. He wasn't a cripple. So it was all these things that flood back through your mind, and we're driving down. The mechanics were following them in the Volkswagen. Earloff Motors in Grosvenor Street had loaned us the finest Galaxy to drive down to the presentation in, and we were doing a good job talking, and out of the sky, because Bob was flying down in his own aircraft, Bobby Altoff, South African champion, and his own aircraft turned out to be a bloody tiger moth, and he coasted over the top of us to frighten 7 bells out of us, which he succeeded in doing, because suddenly the windscreen's full of this tiger moth, because he'd coasted down, but the problem was he hit the Volkswagen ahead of us. And the mechanics wound up in the ditch, and it was like looking at a kaleidoscope. This can't be happening. And the tiger moth sort of settled down on the other side of the road, looking a lot worse for wear, with saggy wings and bits and pieces sort of bouncing here and there, but all tough still in the cockpit. And I can remember looking at all this, and Whitmore's beautifully cultured voice coming across, Frank, what fucking accent do we attend first? So I used to qualify Sir John's car in at places like, well, all the way through all the American tracks, and it was a Trans Am series, and I'd put on his overalls and his helmet, and I'd be out in the dirt and out in the grass and everywhere, and all the Americans just loved a Sir, and they'd be up the next day. God damn, Sir John, you're looking awful good out there. You're out here and out there. And he'd say, Frankie, what the bloody hell? I'd say, John, I just can't help. You're such an untidy bastard. And furthermore, you're on the second row of the grid. I happen to be in pole.
What about some of the other drivers? Jim Clark is you consider to be the best? I mean, that's a hard question, but do you reckon he's probably number one?
He was number one in the areas that this is a low budget team, isn't it? You sure you got enough for the race meeting?
Look who's the MC.
Yeah. So with your guest speaker, you're not doing any better with it. Jimmy did not ever realise just how good he was, and you would. And I have been at places like Zandvoort, Zolder, and I'd have a better car than Jimmy. And I can remember at that stage I was trying for the European Championship, and you would get Jimmy, you'd lose a couple of feet on one corner, and you'd lose probably a few metres on the next corner, and so on, going from metric to decimal and back to imperial. But the end product was he had that coordination, he had that flow, and despite the fact you had a better car, the bloke could outdrive you, and you were looking at the sky and thinking, for Christ's sake, I hope it doesn't come on to rain. You know, at the moment I'm not looking too bad, but if it came on to rain, the bloke would make it just look so second-hand, because he had the balance, he had the footwork, and I must say I learned a lot off him. I learned for the first time in my life that before car slides, the tyres go a little bit light, and Jimmy already had worked this out. He said, you take it up to where you feel the tyres just starting to go light, and that's about the limit. I said, you never seem to slide the bloody thing. Well, I just wait for the tyres to go light. And he always had his feet ahead of his hands, and things that I was to learn and put into practice at a later date. But it's only driving against the best in the world, which he was, and he was so good, and he thought doesn't everybody do this? Like when he went across to Indy, he thought, and he qualified in pole. He'd never seen the track, and they made him do the rookie run. And of course, like Jimmy, I'm a rookie. That's great, you know. So he went around, and he was the quickest rookie, and he was already in pole position, and he was only there to qualify. So they flagged him in because they said he'd got too quick too early, and he was too dangerous. And he tried to assure them that he hadn't tried yet. You know, goddamn cheeky Scotsman coming in here telling blown ass, come the race, he won't see the way, and it all went on. Anyway, the bloke won the race, and you know, started and was never headed. But in all fairness, in the years earlier when Jack went across, Jack would have won the race had they been on Firestones. But the problem was they were on Dunlops, and the tyres wouldn't last out a fuel stop. So they had to make unnecessary stops, and then towards the end the wheel wouldn't come off, and it was tyres that brought about the demise of the whole thing. So, you know, it's always a set of circumstances. Jimmy had Chapman, he'd thought about it, he'd looked at the rules and regulations, and he was your typical travelling salesman chap when he could, he understood the rule books, he understood the law, and he knew he needed Jimmy. Jimmy didn't know, Jimmy could have got anywhere without Chunky Chapman. But, and you know, Chunky wasn't any great strides in a whole heap of areas. He was just clever on powerful weight ratios that did make a lot of things too light. And I can remember him landing an aircraft at Brands Hatch. And towards the end of the runway at Brands Hatch, which was quite short, he realised he wasn't going to make it. So he flew the aircraft around and put the powerful on and blew all the Boy Scouts tents over. The landing gear collapsed and the propellers dug in the ground and probably buggered up the crankshafts on both engines. And Chunky wasn't hanging around, he walked straight out over Hazley's wife and never switched anything off. Alan Mann went back into the cockpit, switched it all off, the high pressure fuel pumps and everything, and then helped Hazel out. Chunky's looking at all the Boy Scouts trying to pick up their cornflakes and what was left of their breakfast. Yeah. So, you know, at all levels, where you've seen, you know, the best, but I never ever saw Eric Broadley ever collapse or lose his cool, or and he had some great guys under him, from the Patrick Heads to the John Bernards to whatever, the Tony Southcotes. They all learnt the philosophy of Eric Broadley. And although Patrick Head might be having a bad run with the Williams at the moment, but it's basically shortage of drivers, and there's only so many Michael Schumachers about. And the Damon Hill thing should have stayed, and so on. And they fragmented the whole thing, and then along came the tyre situation at the same time, and it wasn't the same team for a while. But don't worry about the Patrick Heads of this world. They shall be back and will be back.
What about some of the other Australian drivers that we don't hear so much about? Paul Hawkins, we never hear about Paul Hawkins, and what about Brian Muir? Can't hear.
Well, I drove a lot with Brian and I drove a lot with Paul, so I got to know both guys pretty well. Two totally different individuals. Brian was a solid, steady plodder who would give you a car back, and you could work with the man. Paul, I never co-drove with because there was a fair bit of rivalry, and Paul was going to make his own name and do his own thing. The only thing you could be assured of with Paul, like Gilles Villeneuve, you could be assured Hawkins was never going to die in bed. From day one I worked that lot out, and I just thought, well, although I got to know him and he was anti the establishment. Certainly Popey wouldn't have survived 5 minutes. He was very much anti-religion. He'd grown up in a very religious household, and he had turned the other way. But pretty brave sort of a lad, a great guy to be in a tight situation with. I seen him turn loose with a shooting gallery one night in Claremont-Ferrand when the bloke wouldn't give him the prize Hawkins wanted, so he just shot all the other prizes to bits. Drove Ken Tyrrell's Mini in the middle of the Dodgem car ring at Zandvoort. Won that round before the police arrived. Went Innes Island and a whole heap of renegades. John Cooper got picked up at Bridget's Bar at Reims or Roms, which is your Champagne area. While they were inside arresting them to bring them out, Hawkins undone all the wheels on the gendarmerie. And when the police locked Innes Island, and there was a whole heap of renegades, Richie Ginther, and what have you, all in a police van. I think it ran for a good 25 feet before all the wheels fell off. Settled in the highway with Gint through an island screaming to get us out of this dangerous thing as they were killing us. And, so this was Paul. Top driver, top bloke, too brave for his own good. Liked to drink or three. I've seen the time when I've had to go to bed and left his head over the bucket with a pillow to stop the bucket company's throat. Let him shout for his favourite friend Bert into the bottom of the bucket. And a hard liver. And apart from putting Dickie Stoops' car into Monaco Harbour, which was probably the highlight and the thing he was most remembered for, that it was not a very clever car, and Hawkins was trying to hold it up there. And Dickie Stoop, affectionately known in the trade as Ben Richard. And you're still thinking about that one, so, yeah, but Brian never was a prankster, enjoyed life, enjoyed a drink, but was always solid, always fit, always could be relied upon to get the car home if it was humanly possible, and a great guy to share a car with. He was like a Denny Holm. Denny would have the insight to what was required. He'd hand the car back in good nick. When I didn't take the works drive with Brabham, or when I was I was thinking about it, and Brabham was going to pay me £6,000, I think, and Walter Hayes was going to pay me 15 at Fords, and the best other Formula One thing I think was BRMs at about 8,000. And I went to Kenny Tyrrell and said, "Well, give Dennis a drive because he's bloody good." Ken said, "Denny will never be there. He's too fat and he's too lazy." And Denny was to make Ken, of course, eat his words later on because he was to become world champion. And And I had a similar problem flogging him to Jack at the time because I wanted to go off and take the Ford deal, and because Ford was sick of Jimmy winning in the touring cars. And they said, if you're prepared to swallow your pride and we want to advertise Ford wins, not Clark wins. So Jimmy wanted to go on and Colin was making too many demands, so we all had a bit of a shuffle around, and then he wound up with the drive with Bradman. But he was a great guy to share a car with in long distance races, and we drove a lot for Sid Taylor in the 270 Lolas. And Sid would be this a bit like the team tonight. It was a bit of a budget thing. I can remember coming in once with Sid and saying, look Sid, the brakes are shot, there's only 4 gears left in the box, and I need one of them. It was at Silverstone. I need 1 gear for Stowe. The fuel tank sprung a leak, and it's going to cost a lot of money if I persevere with this thing and get it home. And also, I'm having to watch the temperature gauge, and it's getting a bit of oil surge, and I'm having to declutch on the corners. He said, do you think you can press on for another couple of laps and just persevere with the problems? You couldn't phase Sid, you couldn't tell him, and I mean, we bought his little Lotus deal home at Le Mans at one stage, and there's Sid, and he had a whole heap of people around him, well-wishers, and everybody thought they were friends of Sid's, and Sid thought they were friends of ours, and and being Irish, and the highlight that I can remember with Sid was I was at Mondello Park having a lot of trouble with Peter Gethin. We were fighting over pole position, but Sid's dad resolved all that. They were cleaning Peter's car up after the race and just changing a gear ratio because it wasn't quite on song, much to my dismay. And because I think he was already 0.2, 0.3 quicker than I was. And there was a fair bit of petrol around the garage, and Sid's dad came in and lit his pipe up. So I then inherited pole position in the race. I never did send the old man the cheque, but I was grateful at the time. Stephen?
When I was in the magazine business, I got, it was in the JPS days, I got a press release from the cigarette company, and there was something in there that I didn't know about Frank, and I've never really had the opportunity to ask him about before tonight, and that is his career as a stunt driver and rider in films, and in particular with Steve McQueen in Bulletin and The Great Escape. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about that and about the man himself.
Bloody hell. That's a book in itself. That's a bit hard. Steve McQueen, the man, was Ali McGraw and these people. Steve is a sort of bloke in a room like this. He would get up and leave the table, and then nobody would know why he left. And if the wrong wine was brought in, he'd throw it at the waiter, and just as well the bloke could catch it, because if he didn't, it'd hit the wall. He went out at one stage to pick a girl up at an airport, and she arrived in a different hairdo, and he just told John Sturgeon, who was then directing the film, to turn around and send her home. She never knew what she'd done wrong. Difficult man, genius, clever man around cars, clever bloke on a motorbike. The Great Escape, they done that at Orsett Hall. The insurance companies were getting a bit toey about who would do what, and I eventually wound up doing the jump over the barbed wire fence and the long range stuff, because at a distance in those days, and everybody will say bullshit, but they were able to toffee me up to look a bit like McQueen on a motorcycle. And having done that, and then the Bullet one, the last scene into the service station, where the car was supposed to hit the curb and trip over, it hit some steel cables at hub height, and went over, and the whole deal was it was going to be one take unless they got it right, because working with these people and film people is not my scene, but it was in between recovering from accidents, and you'll get one cameraman arguing with the other, You know, I just had the light right ducky and it was my scene and everything was beautiful, and now that bitch has got it. It's not that I had it planned, and I'm going to have a word with the director tonight, I'm telling you. No, it was great. It was in a non-permissive. No, it's natural. But he had the insight, he had the ability, he could take on anything and make it work in that particular field. And when they were filming the Le Mans film, Piper, they'd had the irresponsibility of the people. They had a large liquid lunch. The idea was for Piper to come down and go through White House in the 917 Porsche. And Piper just had one too many glasses. He was about 5 feet behind the accident on cold tyres, a bit too much fuel in the tank, and McQueen got one of the best accidents on record, and which appeared in a Le Mans film. It wasn't a stunt, it was just David Piper screwing it up. David drives quite well these days with a wooden leg, and as Dickie Atwood says, you know, I spray it occasionally and keep the ants out of it. It's not bad, you know. He's bloody slow, but if we go to Amber and he hits the lake, of course he's going to float. So it has an advantage. But they were, and you know, the McQueen side of it is a difference. It wasn't motor racing. Steve often, he wanted to get into it a lot more, and had the ability to do just that, but with what he was doing and the insurance companies, there wasn't enough money in the bank to insure the bloke. And he was a bit like when Charles de Gaulle wanted Jean-Claude Keely, which I got involved in that lot, to train the bloke for Le Mans. You eventually have to say to the hierarchy, the bloke cannot start, he's too brave and you're going to have a death on your hands. And this was more or less a McQueen scenario, to let him loose in a high-powered car. He didn't have that patience, and he was like that with his arty stuff. It just had to be right. He wouldn't have settled the learning curve that it takes to keep cars on the black bit and keep yourself out of hospital, because you can't get a hospital bed sponsored. As I'm sitting here talking to you, I never wanted to be the quickest in motor racing, I just wanted to be the oldest. And there is a vast difference in serving that apprenticeship to get to the stage where you know right from wrong.
Speaking of accidents, you've been remarkably free from them, but the worst one you ever had wasn't in the car, was it?
No, the worst tuck-up I had was in a surf boat, but, you know, that was basically stupidity, and we'd won the, I think we'd won the Australian surf titles in surf boats at that stage, and one of the magazine's picks, or one of them wanted a photograph, and it was a big day off Manly, off Ferry Bower, and I was a bit late. I was sweeping the boat because they needed it that way for the picture, and I didn't bring the crew far enough aft quick enough, and the wave was too big anyway. As I jumped on the sweep to square the boat up, the oar broke. I went forward and hit my head, and then got blown through the bottom of the boat. So it was a bit different to, and boats in those days were a different construction to what they are now. So it was all, I suppose if you could have a historic boat, if you're having an historic boat race, you know, it'd be out at Eastern Creek. If the creek was still there, that is. But, you know, it was that type of thing, and it is I suppose, stupidity prevailing over common sense. And you can look back on it all and know when you've done it wrong. But of course, if you're stuffed on about a 40-foot wave, it's a bit late to recognise you've made a big mistake. But there we are.
What about some of the cars? You mentioned the 917. What about your development work with the GT40 and your love affair with the P68?
Well, these are all cars that were being built by various designers, and you've got to realise that if you're doing enough testing, It's no different to testing an aircraft or doing anything. If you do enough miles, the things are going to get up and bite you. And designers are learning. You know, somebody has to get up and take the credit for the design at some stage. So the press are going to feature somebody. So it's always the hard work in the early stages. The P3, the GT40 when it first went to Le Mans, Roy Salvadori said, "It's too difficult a car, I'm not driving it. It's too dangerous." Lucien Bianchi had an enormous accident in them. Cunningham, not Cunningham, Briggs Cunningham. There was another one of the Americans had an enormous accident up past the pit. They really were knocking themselves around until they decided. And I was testing at Riverside when we eventually sorted out the major problem, and we had decided to leave the Cobra behind, do the GT40, but we might run the bigger car. And the Mark II was a real problem because that was over a 200 odd 4-speed gearbox, and it was good for about 250 mile an hour, and as we saw, we got the thing up to over 250. But at about 220, the front was coming off the deck, and at Riverside, I came in and said, it is inherently unstable. The front comes off the deck. Now, I don't know what's going on. The designer said that the wind tunnel, such as it was these days in design, it had positive force at the front at all times. So I said, well, you get in it and I'll show you. He wanted to get in it. And of course, the mechanics had all had a ride in these things, and they were delighted to strap him in because they'd never been in a car with this sort of acceleration. And I was a bit, pissed off to think the man was so stupid and actually took me up on my offer. So we took out of the pit, and low gear, I think, would pull about 85 because it was a 4-speed box. You had to try and get your ratios together somewhere. Second was good for about 140, third was good for close to the 200, and then you could poke it in the top and it accelerated. And so I hit the straight at Riverside, having been a bit angry and give this bloke a bit of an adventurous trip up the back through the corners. Hit the back straight and said, now, like the watch, because the front's going to start to come off the deck. But he'd already opened his mouth in an acceleration mode, and his tongue had gone down his throat. So he was suffocating, was starting to alter colour in the face. So I had to stop the car and, squeeze the jaw and hook the tongue out of the throat, which was a normal thing for somebody being in the surf and drowning. So I was no stranger to that one. And then I drove him back to the pit because he wasn't alone in his knickers. So they had to pick up this, not really Chanel number 5, I can assure you, and remove him and flew him over to Edwards Air Force Base, and I think that's the last I saw of that designer. But you do get them from time to time. They always want to... so he never did find out, but that was a problem. The air was actually attaching itself to the slope of the bonnet, which was a little wrong, and was obtaining lift like an aircraft wing, and it was picking the car up at the front. It required over 200, about 215 mile an hour, and then it had a firm hold and lifted the front up. Then they altered the outlet of the radiator and put a little scoop on the top so the air could flow out, and one airflow interrupting the other solved the problem, and a little spoiler at the back. And then it was quite a stable and turned out to be a very easy vehicle to drive. Never as good as the T70 Lola, never as accurate at speed, but alongside the Porsche, believe you me, a doddle. Which once again, with the Jackie X and these people pressing away and the Rodriguez working at the Porsches, they turned that into a very stable motor car in its latter years. But in the early stages, that was, you required all the road You didn't need any overtaking moves or whatever, especially in the wet. Was a handful. But then, if you finished with the thing, you were reimbursed accordingly, which is what happened at Nürburgring. P68, well, they had ideas of wings coming up at speeds and sprint weighting the things against the force of the air, and you know, we saw what happened to Brucey McLaren when the back of the car flew up at Goodwood. The bloke lost control of it at 200 clicks and went into one of the bomb shelters, and that was that. And we tested this thing. I mean, a remarkable looking car for its era. It was light years in advance for shape. Len Bailey, who was the designer, had a great flair for putting a wondrous set of clothes on a bloody awful skeleton. And in the later years, by the time David Piper and these blokes had bought the thing as an historic car, they'd lengthened the wheelbase and the bell housing accordingly, and altered the aerodynamics of it a little bit. And as John Surtees said, I sat with John in an aircraft coming back from Germany, from Munich, where he'd been across riding a BMW bike, and John said it was a pleasure to drive. I never drove it in its later years, although I did climb into it at Goodwood, and did drive up the Goodwood Hill climb. But the seat was wrong and the head was hitting the roof and it stank of petrol. So I was quite pleased to arrive at the top and said to the boy, you can tootle down the hill in it, and if it catches a light, you've got youth on your side to spring out of it. Because it had gull wing doors and the stink of the fumes, you know, it's a good quick way to get a headache, and you have nothing to prove as you get on in years and people say drive this, drive that. Denny Hull, Jack Brabham wander around the world like lost souls, driving absolutely anything and everything, and I still admire Jack climbing on an aircraft last week. He's quite enthusiastic and he's going across to drive the Cobra that I drove at Goodwood last time. And I said, Jack, by the time I hit second gear in it, I tore up the victory speech. I was in the pit lane and I worked out that the performance just wasn't there. But it doesn't worry Jack. You know, he just loves to be there. He loves to be part of the scene. And Mossy's much the same. They just love to be there. And still extremely talented. I mean, give Jack the right car at the right time and he's still very much a competitor.
Frank, we can't afford to have you here much longer. But I think your contract expires at 10, doesn't it? But before you go, I'm sure there are a lot of questions that people would like to ask, and we could go all night and enjoy it. But I know there's some questions they'd like to ask, so can we open the floor, Frank, and let them see what sort of memory you've still got left? Is that a yes?
I really would like to extend that, but no, you take the questions and away we go.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll start with this one.
You ran the Camaro in England in the early 70s, which was, I understand, an aluminium engine ZL1. Did you acquire that from America in that configuration, or did you build it up over in England?
No, it came in from America for the simple reason it all started off at Cologne, where the Ford Motor Company was selling better than 5,000 units to the forces stationed out of Cologne and Bonn, and General Motors wanted a part of the action. And in Europe, the Mustangs were winning, and they wanted the Camaro to go across there to try and win some races from the Mustangs. And the Mustang was a particularly good car, and particularly good in the wet for that era. And so, caught between greed and common sense, we got Lola's to supply a couple of the boys because I was then developing engineer at Lola's, and they supplied a couple of the lads. Adrian Chambers, who run SCA Freight, took the operation on, and we went across and raced at places like Hockenheim, and then General Motors managed to sell a few thousand Chevy Camaros. And that was the object of the exercise, and they sent the cars out. They came out absolutely, virtually as we raced them, with all the bits and pieces on them. and the homologation papers to match. Having said that, we won the Monte Carlo Rally with a Ford Falcon, and in those days you had to make 200 units. And they only ever made 50 of the fiberglass ones, and in between giving the French morning tea, they moved the 50 to another hangar. There was a large liquid lunch, 50 and it was all achieved. Yeah.
Bruce, you've got a question.
My memory of Hope Bartlett is all the way through the movie camera in his hand.
Yeah.
Now, some years ago, I asked you what happened to the Hope Bartlett movies, and I think you said they went to the National Archives, Film Archives.
No.
Oh, they didn't.
No.
Can you tell
Unless
me?
I'm the Film Archives,
Oh,
which I'm not.
can we ever get access to them on video or something?
Well,
like
they've
that?
been
They must be
depleted an awful amount because I have lent them to radio stations like the ABC and Channel 7 and all kinds of people, Channel 9, and then you try and get them back. You just cannot get them back. And yet you'll see little snippets of them appear here and there from time to time, like Phillip Island, 1929, the Grand Prix there. I think it was won by Bob Lee Wright and a singer, and the main event was won by Thompson in a Bugatti, and so on. And that I had all that sort of stuff, but they wanted it and promised faithfully, but you just can't get it. So the stock is down by virtue of the fact, and some of Alec Mildrum's stuff, I have that as well. And I still have some quite good stuff, but not the stuff that I really cherished.
Could we get what you have got on the video or something?
It is on video.
It should be lost.
It's on video. It's all there. Mike Raymond of Channel 7 picked up a whole lot of it, but of course it has no sound at the back of it, and you have to have somebody to say, well, that's so-and-so and that's so-and-so, and it's Ron Ewing's Buick and it's Andrews in the Austin, and so on. Names that probably even in this room, and you know, Teddy Gray's Tajiro and a whole heap of things, Tornado rather, I said Tajiro, but wrong, it wasn't Le Mans, it was Teddy Gray locally, and you know, the Jimmy Johnsons and the Mary Seeds and all those, but you have to be there to recognise the cars, and you know, Doug Chivers in the first of the Lotuses to ever make the country, and so on. And you just have to, so the value is only there if somebody's got the retention and the recognition and know that it comes up, and I'm sort of in a quandary of, and it all happens so quick, like a lot of people never talked through when they were taking the film to see whether there was enough room to put the commentary on. In later years it got a lot easier because the cameras developed a bit more and so on, and it was a bit, but then people can remember later on the precious stuff like the black and white, and the boats being loaded off the ferry at Phillip Island, and you used to get a permit from the police station to run an unlicensed, unregistered vehicle down to the ferry, and it only needed a couple of cars to go in front, and then people could follow the trail of dead dogs because they'd rush out the back of the front wheel and the rear one would run over them. And you know, it was that era which has gone and lost forever. It's like, if ever you've seen a V16 VRM, which I saw at Donington for the first time, and revving them and watching the leaves come down off the trees with the actual repercussion of the exhaust, the vibration of these things, and the ears, as I say, it's no wonder people like Bradman are absolutely stone deaf. The noise was horrendous. If you'd had a bad practice and stuck behind Reg Parnell or Gonzalez in a BRM, not that you'd be stuck behind them for long because they never ran for more than a couple of laps. But nevertheless, while they were running, the noise was absolutely awesome. Yeah.
Could the club borrow some of those? Because
And I'd like to stand here and say yes, but one day I'm going to stop work and get it documented, and then, you know, have some copies and then people can have a look at them. I know the need, but I also have a museum, and I also am going to put in some video of some of that old stuff, which I'm slowly working to. But I've got 50 odd vehicles and lots of good floor space, and it all takes some putting together, and I can do so much. And to stand up here and say, yes, you can have it. You can have it when I'm certain about it.
You're immortal, but we mightn't last long enough.
I've got enough, like this whole deal here, I want you to know, with this budget here. And I was saying to my wife in the cab coming here, I have enough money to last me till I die, I've just got to go tonight.
Frank, your opinion of the drivers you've had under you in the Australian circumstance, from Alan Grice to Tony Longhurst and others, would you have that, please?
Oh, good one. I suppose if I was to, and I've had Alan Jones, I've had Jimmy Richards, I've had Grice. I suppose if it was This Is Your Life, I don't suppose you'd get them to walk onto the stage. If I was looking for a reference, I can remember when Tony left the infrastructure and the cocoon we'd created for him. I said, Sonny, go and build yourself a dais and put it in your own backyard, because it's the only way you're ever going to stand on one. And Gricey wasn't that good. Jimmy Richards was absolutely, could have made his living overseas. Jimmy was exceptionally good. Kind on cars, just absolutely first class. Alan Jones, I don't know about Alan. I saw Alan when he was past his prime. I always believed, and Patrick Head said, that Carlos Reutemann should have been world champion that year, and maybe that's been unkind, but Alan was a particularly good driver. He wouldn't be world champion. Reutemann was a little better, but Alan was a better politician. I found Alan very hard on the transmissions and gears. He's not an endurance bloke. He's a sprint bloke. Tony would last 3 gearboxes for 3 races. Jonesy would be 3 gearboxes per race. I did have to ask him, did he hurt the balls of his foot kicking them into gear occasionally? Was it all right? Should I get thicker shoes, Alan? He seemed to think he'd manage all right. So, you know, there we are. And once again, with smart solicitors and smart lawyers and things like that, you can wind up with all kinds of things slapped on you, because the bloke was world champion, and you don't get to be world champion. And internationally, we saw young Craig Lowndes go overseas. Went overseas with a couple of million, and he really did not qualify in the tops. And he certainly didn't feature, and he's the best we've got at the moment. So it is a hard school. So if you take off as a little boy to get your teeth fixed on the free medical, and you survive it all, amongst that company over there, because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of hard charges. And it's no good when they come out here to Bathurst saying our blokes blew them off, because they've left their infrastructure behind. It doesn't matter who you bring out. The bloke is not a joint, and he's not going to bend the other person's car. And if they are doing a time around Bathurst, that's what they're going to settle for. Because they want to get on that aircraft and get back to where they're earning money all in one piece. It'd be nice to spend your whole racing season in Bathurst Hospital. It is not productive and not clear thinking. So we're never going to see that type of talent unless they bring their own cars, their own infrastructure, like Tom Walkinshaw did with the Jaguars, and then you're going to see how it all happens. And Rudy Eggenberger, I think, came out with the Ford Sierras, and then you see how it ought to be. But just to bring one solo driver out, you've got a talented man, but you haven't got the complete package.
How about Kevin Bartlett and Max Stewart?
all good guys, all good guys. Whether they wanted to go overseas or whether Maxie went across, tried out at Indy, and not Maxie, Kevin. Alec thought the world of them. I thought they were good because I was the one who got Alec Mildred to give them a drive. Because there's two guys there, you've got Maxie, Stewart and Kevin, and if you picked either one, you wouldn't have a loser to pilot your cars around, because I'm only here for the Tasman series. Glenn Abbey's got all the data, he can set the cars up, and you pick either Kevin or Max, I'm sure you'll feature in the Gold Star, which is what Alec wanted to do anyway. As a Gold Star recipient himself, he intended to stay on top, and both Kevin and Max were capable of doing that. They did.
Just, Peter's got a question down the back there. Just let me tell you a memory of mine. Those of you who have been in this club for a long time will remember that we had a golden opportunity, a wonderful opportunity, it would have been the mid-80s, to have 3 separate nights of lectures on driving by Frank, and then 2 days at Amaroo Park. And anyone who remembers that will, as I do, will remember that as a great privilege, but also as a wonderful learning experience. And one of the things that I remember you telling us, Frank, was about coming into a corner, settling the car, brushing the brakes off, and then on again. And I watched Jim Richards do it. He's obviously a student of yours because he's the only driver that I've seen in modern racing who does exactly that. The brake lights come on, off, on, into the corners, and that, I always think of those days at Amaroo Park. It was one of your golden rules.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like a short talk in economics. There's no such thing. It takes light years, unless you're Paul Keating, of course. It takes light years to actually learn and work, and you have to work with people and you retain so much. If anybody's unfortunate enough to persevere with golf, they know how long it takes to get into single figures. And with driving, I think the only way you can look at it and say, what handicap do you want to drive off? Because it is a long, and the people that are good are the people like Bratton that done the miles testing, and it's all very well to understand something and balance, and how to balance your car, how to work your tyres, how to work with your car and not against it, and how to work with your brakes and not against it, how to keep your feet ahead of your hands, but it takes practice. If it was easy, there'd be Michael Schumachers everywhere, all signing on for about, well, Michael wouldn't get out of bed these days for 8 million, but a lot of the minor people would. It's a lot of money, but you know, the Jimmy Clarks and those people, they're born. People like myself can fabricate themselves up there, providing you understand what to do and you don't do it too quickly. Because, as I said, hospital beds do not make good sponsorships.
Peter Malloy down the back. You had a question, Peter?
No, I'm just agreeing with Frank about Alan Grice, that was all.
Which bit?
Pete, you haven't got parliamentary privilege, you're in a lot of trouble.
John Sexton.
Frank, with respect to all the data we have on aerodynamics from your days with Porsche 917, how did Mercedes-Benz get it so wrong last year? This year?
It's in the quest of speed, actually, and they'd get it wrong if you had an arsehole like me driving for you. You'd be strong enough to walk in and say this, like the designer, this is dangerous. But because of the young Mark Webbers and people like that, they are dead nervous. If they say it wrong, they might lose their drive, so they persevere with it. So the scenario goes on until everybody's past the point of no return. And if you put wing and stuff on them, and the oil pitch characteristic in the wind tunnels may have been all right, but it's still not Le Mans, it's still not safety barriers, it's still not creating the entire circuit, like gear changes, braking points, turbulent air between other competitors and what have you. And the accidents always seem to happen a little bit, I saw them, in turbulent air. So obviously the underside of the vehicle wasn't right and became very unstable very quickly, as they did take off and climb to quite a height until they lost forward speed with the onrush and the total thing installed and fell out of the sky like a tiger moth. But you can get it wrong quite easily in this day and age, because there is the brains of the industry, there is the computers of the industry, and it's all very well to have onboard computers. Who does the downloading? And at some stage somebody must have seen the graph on the suspension going light. It was all there. So you really can't blame the drivers. And the wind tunnel, it must have showed at some stage that somebody bullshitted and glossed over it. And then the drivers persevered with it because all the engineers said it was right. Well, bollocks, get in and come flying with me. Share this experience. It is like picking an aircraft up at Reykjavik. You say to the people that have worked on it, you all come for a test flight. Amazing, I'll work on it for another 2 days.
Any more questions for Frank?
Just one.
Yes, Peter.
Frank, you indicated earlier, tell us about Teddy Kromback's Russian race.
Oh, yeah.
Russian race, yeah, well, we went across with Pete Riffs and Denny Hull, myself, and to rate against the might of Russia, and went across in quite good cars. So it wasn't a case of who was going to win, it was by how far. And what do you do with rubles? I mean, just what do you do with them? So Kromback had it all worked out that you buy microscopes and you sell the lenses in France at a place he knew because they had the best lenses in the world. And that's French francs back to sterling, sterling back on the boat to Dover, home sweet home. All seemed very simple. You were given a schedule where to drive down to Stalingrad around the Red Square, which the race was then, and we shared it up. Revson was to win one, Denny was to win one, and I was to win the other, and we'd split it all up. And Revson didn't want to know about the microscope scheme. He said it was too dicey, we had to come through the Brandenburg Gate. He didn't want to know about that. So he found a 6-foot, beautifully built Russian street sweeper. Lovely girl. About 18 years old and magnificent. And Revy, we only were there for an allocated time, and we had so much money, so Revy decided he wouldn't buy any microscopes. Danny and I bought 40 between us, and Revy spent his money, I suppose, on horizontal refreshment, I suppose. The end product was we had to drive back, and Revy was sort of transported out of the country. I think he was too weak to drive anyway. So we got to the Brandenburg Gate, and all the way down the road, Denny, whose dad, and people may or may not know, that his dad was a VC winner, and Clive was an unusual man where he could find anything. He could divine water, gold, anything. I've seen people put an engagement ring in a paddock with Clive inside, come back into the house, and Clive could walk straight out and find the engagement ring. It'd be 2 acres away, but he'd find it. And a remarkable man. Insight. The day Denny crashed at Indianapolis, Clive rang me up that night and said, Denny's going to have an accident, can you get in contact with him? This is a bit difficult. Clive, practice has already started, and within the hour we heard that Denny had had the accident. So Clive was an odd bloke. He used to say, do you want to know where you're going in life? I'd say, Clive, keep it to yourself. I didn't want to know about Titanic things and what have you, but the end product was we got to the Brandenburg Gate, and Denny wanted, on the way, should we pack the luggage behind and make a run for it? And I said, for Christ's sake, these blokes are armed to the teeth. We'll last about 5 seconds. Anyway, all tweaked up, we arrived, and here is Klaus there, and he's bloody got AKs, he's got everything. More bloody armament, he could have started the war by himself. Halt. So we bloody stopped. Walked over. Sprechen the Deutsch? No. Parlez-vous français? No. Parli Italiana? No. Do you speak English? Jawohl. Have you any sink to declare? 40 microscopes. It's a very good joke. Good, Morgan. We drove out. John Cromback's plan worked perfectly. French francs back to sterling, lenses in the French shops. Everybody was happy. End of deal. That was all right.
20 microscopes.
He missed out on all that bargaining. Brabham steering, Brabham everything, Brabham roll centres. It was just a monocoque. It didn't even have bag tanks in it. We'd lined the thing with a synthetic rubber, the same as aircraft wings. So it was a Brabham to drive. It had the little V8 Alpha in it. It worked very well. Didn't have a great deal of power, and like a lot of Italian things, leaked a lot of oil, and you had to dismantle it and put it back together, because it wasn't the oil consumption was the problem, it was what had dripped out on the highway. But all in all, it was just a Brabham to drive. It stopped, it went like a Brabham, it pointed like a Brabham, and it was a good Brabham because it was quite rigid. And Ron looked at it and applied a fair bit of the technology to his Indy car, and then they went on to make their monocoques. But it was a Len Bailey designed monocoque under Ron's supervision. So, you know, they were the thoughts. It worked beautifully for that era.
I think that's about all we can afford tonight, Frank. So we'll have to let you sit down. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for Gloria and Frank coming down from their home on the Gold Coast to be with us tonight and on the weekend. And before you sit down, perhaps you both come up, because our President, John Hunter, has some presentations to make to you.
We would have got Frank some flowers, but we thought they'd look better.
I have my friend Ian Spees can do that for me.
Now, Frank, this is for you. This is a...
Well,
I should... Yes, here we are.
Well done.
This is another piece of Brian Caldersmith's magnificent artwork. We're very fortunate to have Brian in our club to do these things for us. But, that's the original. That's the cover of the poster that we had designed for the meeting. We'd like you to take that with you as a memento of the evening.
You realise I can only pay for it in instalments.
They'll accept microscopes, Frank.
You've got to wear one of these.
He's got to come back.
And there's a few other little bits and pieces in that you can take with you as well. Thank you very much, Frank. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
I'm just sorry that I haven't got something like a fox hat or something like that. That is worth money. It's a bugger to settle for Terry Towner, isn't it? Yes, when they brought Charles out here for the opening of the RSL club, you know, when he came out and who's the knows, because he's not a racer, our man from the RSL club, what's his name? Bruce Ruxton, that's right. Brucey met him at the airport, and Charlie's got a fox hat on, and that was great. And he went all the way to Charlie studied this all through the night, and he got up and made a wonderful speech at the opening of the Bulladoola RSL club, and said that, you know, the Australian New Zealand Army Corps and what have you, and the loyalties, and it was a brilliant speech. Everybody was so impressed. And he sat down at Bruce Ruxton's table, and Bruce said to him, he said, well, that Charlie, he said, I want to put it on your too heavy. He said, but the reason for the fox hat? And he said, yes, he said it was Mummy's idea, really. He said, that right, Charlie, is it? Yeah, he said, Mummy, I told her I was coming to Australia to open the RSL at Bulladoola. She says, where's the fox hat?